General Rose, good morning and welcome to this committee, and thank you for agreeing to come and talk to us. Our minds are on our current inquiry, just beginning, which is on the situation in the West Balkans, the UK's involvement in it now, drawing, of course, heavily on the history of the area, which dominates so much, and trying to look forward to the next stage of developments. We're trying to stand aside a little from the eternal, ubiquitous issue of Brexit and the future of the European Union, but obviously these things are going to become entangled with our studies in one way or another. Now, you were commander of UNPROFOR, 94 to 95. I also read you're colonel of my regiment, the Coldstream Guards, which...
I was for 10 years, sir, but handed over to someone more suitably equipped than I was at my age.
Well, I'm very glad about that. It's a very superior regiment. And altogether, you've been involved, almost no other person has uniquely, in the affairs of the region. So we're going to ask you, if we may, a number of questions, and I'm going to start straight away with the little opening question, which is those rifts and fractures of 1990s. Have they been the apparent peace that has followed? Is that fragile or is that real? Is the interstate and interethnic conflicts still about to explode again, or can we look forward to a reasonably stable future? What is start with your general judgment on the region and where we've got to.
So it might be helpful if I made a very short statement which covers those points,
please,
which I prepared beforehand.
Excellent.
And that will lead on to the various subsidiary questions which I posed prior to coming here today. But whilst it's obviously clear that the Bosnian War was the Balkans War was probably the most violent of all the conflicts that took place at that time, I don't think it's still fully appreciated by the international community, including, of course, ourselves, that the linkage between that war and the problems that are facing the Western Balkans today are very close indeed, and that many of the problems that exist today were generated by the way that war was ended. If we accept the many reports that we can read, both in for example, the Senate Committee of Foreign Affairs, a recent one they made in May, our own parliamentary inquiries, the European Union stabilisation reports, then I think we would all agree that today in Bosnia we see a rising trend of xenophobia, racial tensions, continuing corruption, evidence to meet the standards of good governance required by the European Union, a rising element of radicalisation, particularly amongst the Muslim communities, and of course the country, because of the reluctance of the Bosnian Serbs to sign up to the dream of Dayton, which was a single nation, the country is still as fragmented, I think, as ever, and is actually at risk of being a failed state. Now, much of this tension and unhappiness in the region, I think, stems from the Dayton Peace Accord that, in my view, was built on a lie and has led, therefore, to injustices which still reverberate today. Common view of what happened in Bosnia is that the UN mission failed and that the people of Bosnia were saved by military intervention and by NATO bombing, which forced the Serbs to the peace table in Dayton, Ohio. Otherwise put, in the way of my good friend David Harland, who of course was the original author of the UN inquiry into the massacre of Srebrenica, the 1995 military intervention, the Dayton Agreement, and the NATO-led implementation force are seen as redemptive examples of the potential of military intervention under American leadership. Nothing, in fact, could be further from the truth. For what actually happened, and this is important, I think, for the committee to understand, what happened when the Bosnian War came to the end is that the UN was succeeding remarkably well in its desired objectives, which of course were delivering humanitarian aid to a population that was caught up in a three-sided civil war. Looking back, Bosnia remains one of the few major conflicts of our time where no one died, or very few people died, either of cold or hunger. But a key peacekeeping force such as UNPROFOR was neither mandated nor equipped to impose peace by force of arms, which of course are warfighting objectives. NATO indeed had calculated that it would take over 400,000 soldiers to bring peace to Bosnia by force alone. And of course NATO had already turned down an invitation by President Izetbegovic in 1992 to stop the war spreading from Croatia. And if NATO, the most powerful NATO military alliance in the world, was not prepared to go war fighting in Bosnia, it defies all logic to expect the lightly armed UN force to do so. Yet that was often the expectation. Nevertheless, by its very presence, the UN were able to bring about necessary conditions in which some sort of peaceful resolution would have been possible. When I commanded in 1994 the UNPROFOR, we halted the fighting between the Serbs, between the Croats and the Muslims, ending up in the Washington Accords. We raised the siege around Sarajevo. We brought about a 4-month cessation of hostilities. What happened to derail this process? Sadly, our efforts at peacekeeping were already being fatally undermined by the NATO and America's reluctance to identify that illegal arms were being smuggled into Bosnia from Iran via Croatia. And indeed, the United States itself lost patience with the peace process and started to illegally arm the Muslims against their own signed up to United Nations resolutions, and in spite of the fact they were actually responsible for implementing those resolutions under Operation Deny Flight and Operation Sharp Guard. The end result, of course, was that the UN mission as a neutral peacekeeping force was destroyed, and all UN attempts at peace breaking, such as those organised by Lord Owen, Cyril Vance, Lord Carrington, etc., all failed. And the NATO and United States too late came to the realization that although they had destroyed the UN peacekeeping mission, they could not replace it, as its presence in the region was limited to air. The war was therefore unnecessarily prolonged, and the suffering of the people continued, including, of course, the terrible massacre of Bosnian Muslims at Srebrenica in 1995. The irony, of course, is that the weapons that were being delivered by then, mainly by the Americans, into Bosnia were going to radical elements, including Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda fighters and many other foreign fighters who were going at that time into Bosnia. And of course, the modern radicalization of the people of Bosnia stems from this unhappy history. The war finally came to an end in 1995, not because of the NATO bombing, but because in August of 1985, the Croatian-led force under Operation Storm invaded Bosnia from the west and took much of the land which the Serbs were hoping to trade for peace on their terms. But even that doesn't give a full account of the story. For Ops Storm was merely a staged, managed event that had been prearranged by Milosevic and Tudjman, who had already agreed in 1994 to end the war between those two countries. The price of peace demanded by Tudjman was the return of the Krajines to Croatia. And I was given a map in August 1994, 1 year before Operation Storm, showing me where the line where the Serb regular forces would withdraw to and where the Croatian forces would attack a year later, where they would halt. The whole episode was a grim charade which resulted in the highest incidence of ethnic cleansing of the entire war, for nearly 200,000 Serbs were driven from their historic lands in the Krajines. Some 21,000 Muslims were driven out of western Bosnia, and another 22,000 Muslims and Croats were driven out of the Republika Srpska. These people today remain displaced from their homes, and again is a source of enormous grievance and instability in the region. In summary, The Dayton Peace Agreement can be described, once again quoting David Harland, as an elite deal between the same three ethno-national elites that had started the war in the first place, and was brokered by the United States with the endorsement of the people whose fate it determined. It cemented a ceasefire that had already been put in place by the UN before the negotiations began, and confirmed the results of ethnic cleansing, often to the advantage of the Serbs. Quite unnecessarily, it created an enduring constitutional arrangements which were both unworkable and discriminatory, and which have prevented the emergence of moderate, pragmatic political forces, and one might therefore add also good governance. I think it's more difficult to find a recent example of history where propaganda and rhetoric replaced reality in decision making. And there was a determination at the time by NATO and the Americans to prove that the bombing and the military force worked. At the 50th anniversary of the NATO conference held here in London in 1999, Prime Minister Blair attempted to reinvent this lie by stating, "We tried to bring peace to Bosnia through the United Nations and with good political officers, but without the willingness to use force, which we now know was necessary. We will not repeat the early mistakes of Bosnia. We will not allow war to devastate a part of our continent, bringing untold death and suffering and homelessness." In saying that, of course, he was clearly paving the way for the forthcoming war in Kosovo, which then, of course, led into the war in Iraq, where indeed we saw untold suffering and devastation and homelessness. By exporting the flawed logic that had originally started in the Balkans through Kosovo into the Middle East, of course, we have visited on those millions of people the awful situation that we see today. And I think that, and I will halt here, that should be the enduring lesson of Bosnia.
Well, my goodness, that's a very full summary of your assessment and a very strong sense here of parts of American policy and the Dayton Agreement and the work of people like Richard Holbrooke. I think I'm going to ask Lord Hannay straight away to ask you what you think the consequences and lessons for the moment are.
Yes, thank you very much, and very nice to see you again, Michael. I don't entirely share your analysis, but I think it would be more useful now to look to the future rather than the present and past, and also to look at wider than just Bosnia, because the former Yugoslavia is a lot more than just Bosnia, although Bosnia is at the heart of some of the problems. And really to ask you what, on the basis of your experience, the international community ought to have learnt now, and how it could best apply those lessons to what I think would be a fairly uncontroversial view, that it is in our interest as an international community to sustain peace and security in the region and to avoid deterioration into hostilities. So what, drawing on the lessons of your time there and looking at the wider former Yugoslavia, do you think the way ahead should be?
I mean, Britain clearly has a major interest in what is going to happen in the West Balkans, and I don't think anyone would sign up to Disraeli's famous quote that no sane man ever involves himself in the Balkans. It's too late for that. We also have some 72 Britain, mainly soldiers, who have died in the Western Balkans since the early 90s. And so we have a great interest in making sure that their lives were not sacrificed for nothing. My own view about how we should proceed is that, of course, Britain must continue outside the European Union to play a major part. We should support the European Union in its attempt to persuade the countries to join not only the European Union, but we should also persuade those same countries to join NATO. We should insist on the standards that are required for membership of both the European Union and indeed NATO being met, both in terms of technical standards but also in moral and judicial standards. And therefore, I believe we've got a full part to play. My worry, of course, is at the moment is that President Trump, the new administration in America, with his isolationist policies, his decision to reduce the budgets that are being employed at the moment in the Western Balkans, will leave a vacuum, which of course might well be filled by the Russians.
Yes. Lord Joplin.
Your presentation, which is, forgive me, mostly history, has been enormously useful to us. But can I bring you back to the Chairman's first question, asking how you assess the current situation as to whether all this could bubble up again and we could find ourselves back where we were?
Well, so I think the situation may well bubble up again. I go back in history, and I think it was Winston Churchill who said the Balkans have too much history, but it's very difficult to separate the present day from history, because what is happening today, people who respond to the event are always going back into history to determine their own responses. And it's not what you're seeing on the surface in the Balkans that counts, it's what's going on under the surface, and old grievances, old alliances are being formed and reformed and reshaped. But the dangers, I think, of Bosnia becoming a failed state, I think, are quite great. I mean, particularly with the reluctance of the Bosnian Serbs to sign up to the idea of having a single entity in that country. And of course, the Dayton Peace Accords enable them, in a way, to flex their muscles, which they've been doing for 20 years and should never have been allowed to do in the first place. But I think there is a serious danger. And then added on top of that, you've got the sort of jihadists who are coming through and being exported. You've got the collapsing economy in Bosnia. I think there is a statistic which I read showing that Bosnia has the highest unemployment youth rate of anywhere in the world. Some 67% of that section of the population are unemployed. And of course that's the very area of the population where you would expect the jihadists to make most ground. So I fear the dangers are considerable. Without going into what is happening in Macedonia and the minority Albanian population there, or what is actually happening in Serbia itself.
Sticking still to today, Lord Wood.
Yeah, can I ask you to go back to what you said about British engagement? I mean, to ask a very basic question, is there a British strategy that's identifiable towards the region? Not just at the moment, but over the last few years.
Actually, I think
and just to add to that, you mentioned very interestingly that our main contribution could be to urge continued membership, continue the process for membership of the EU and NATO. Obviously, our voice on the EU membership may be slightly weaker or less heard now that we're going through Brexit. But more broadly, are there other things we should do other than urge membership of these two organisations that we can do, we can actually have impact with?
Right. I think that the continued support, as I said, those two major should be our primary way of expressing ourselves. But if there are other elements where we can also help at the economic level, for example, or in military training teams, then I think we should continue to do that. And that may be quite separate from what the Americans and NATO are doing or what the European Union are doing. But certainly there is a requirement for a continuing military engagement in terms of training teams, and obviously anything we do to help try and get the economies of those countries going, the better.
And on the first part, is there at the moment a British strategy that's identifiable?
Not particularly, no. I mean, I think at the moment we're still working our way through to the position we should take, and I hope this committee will come up with a sensible and productive view at the end.
Thank you.
Lord Clovis.
Lord Chairman, you mentioned that, I think you said much of the unhappiness at the moment dates back to Dayton and your view for that. Mm-hmm. Is your assessment that the unhappiness is simply going to be the continuation or the development of the failed states, as you mentioned, or are there the grounds for further interstate clash? Because if Dayton may have succeeded in one thing, it may have meant it's very hard for there to be state-to-state conflict. I mean, what's your assessment?
Well, I can't see that any grounds for worrying about an interstate clash in the Balkans. I mean, I think there are too many outside players involved there, and that just would not be possible.
Well, it's related to that, really. If you're identifying the country as being likely to become a failed state, and at least one of the ingredients, if not maybe the principal ingredient in that, is the position of Serbia and the Serbian minority within the state. I mean, what in practical terms can be done to prevent at least the likelihood, the possibility, or even the probability of it becoming a failed state? I mean, it seems to me that these tensions have been there for so long that it's almost impossible to see Serbia, the Serbian part of Kosovo, becoming reconciled to the, leaving aside the rights and wrongs, becoming reconciled to the status quo.
I don't think one should totally despair. There obviously is a lot of feeling amongst especially the displaced people, Serbs who live in Republika Srpska, who have not only come from the Krajinas but have also come from Kosovo, and they have all the. But I think a generation on or two, then I think that as long as we can persuade Serbia through the leverage we exercise with them on the EU, then wish to accede to the European Union, then I think that for the people of Serbia is a greater gain than taking on some extremely unhappy people from the Republic of Serbia and creating trouble next door. I think there's a gameplay going on. I mean, one of the lessons I learned in the Balkans very early on is what you see is not what you get. That's the first lesson. The other rule is that if they're talking, they're generally lying because they have another agenda to pursue. And so I think there's an awful lot of gameplay going on, and I don't think we need to overreact to it. We do have very strong levers which we can actually use to prevent Bosnia-Herzegovina breaking up, and the consequence of that, as you suggest, would be unthinkable. You'd end up with the Croatian element moving across and joining Croatia, and then Europe having to sustain a tiny little unworkable state, a Muslim state in the middle. And I don't think that could happen. As long as we keep faith with our ideals and our policies.
Thank you. John Rose, I probably share the same sentiment with Lord Haney in terms of looking back at the past, and probably wouldn't agree with everything, but it's really interesting to hear you 25 years later or so, how you see it and the lessons that you have drawn from your experience of your deployment and commanding of the AMPROFOR. I was very interested to hear from you that, and encouraged that you think that there is still, in the post-Brexit era, there will be British interest in sustaining the peace and stability in the Balkans. And in Bosnia, this process is kind of run through the EU4 mandate, which actually contains Chapter 7 of it enables the outside force to keep this peace and stability. And each year this mandate comes for renewal, and I expect it's sometime end of September or in October this year. And each time, what I have seen, this gets sort of slightly watered down to accommodate mainly Russian concerns that there is too long and too present NATO and EU military presence in Bosnia. In your experience, having seen how it works when troops are on the ground and don't have a sufficient mandate, do you think that the British government should pursue this and ensure that it doesn't get watered down furthermore, or that the worst case scenario, it doesn't get abandoned because we may never be able to have such a mandate, to come to the position that Bosnia or any Bosnia genuinely disintegrates, as you have just tried to explain to us what it would look like in the future?
I mean, I think it's terribly important that we do, A, keep a military presence, and B, that when it is there, it has a meaningful mandate, because that sends a signal not only internally to the people of Bosnia, but also externally, including to the Russians. And I have the view that NATO is the prime, provides the prime defence of Europe, and therefore that NATO should maintain its interest there, and if we're doing that as part of NATO or doing that independently, it doesn't really matter. We're still being seen by the outside world as doing it as a part of a great alliance, and that will obviously also send signals to the Russians, who I think are being opportunistic. I don't think they have any grand strategy for making the Western Balkans part of a sort of post-Warsaw Pact alliance of any sort, but I think they like to cause mischief. They like the fact that the mafia can go on running guns, people and what have you through the Balkans, and they quite like the destabilised. They keep the area destabilised because it worries the Americans and us. but I don't think we should necessarily overreact to that. And again, we've got levers on the Russians as well.
Lordovi,
Rose, on this very point of NATO, which you mentioned there, now what is your assessment of the level of integration of the region within NATO itself, and what do you see as the strategic benefits for the countries in the region of membership of NATO? To what extent are they actually integrated within what you could call the Euro-Atlantic framework, and NATO specifically?
I mean, I don't have any current experience of how the people actually think, but my instinct is that they all lean towards Europe, they all lean towards America, and therefore the West, and that they, again, the people who wish to keep poor governance, the corruptions that go on in all those countries, will go on playing the game that we're playing with the Russians in order to worry the West, to stop us getting too strenuous about them meeting the standards and joining Europe. And it's a sort of gameplay that's going on at the moment. My view is that as long as we maintain those high standards which we require them to achieve before they join either NATO or the European Union, and don't allow ourselves to get watered down in the same way that we were discussing the military arrangements, then I think people would have to respond to those positions that we take. But it has to be a firm position, because a lot of parties out there trying to undermine it. The people themselves of that region are the victims of what's going on. And I know perfectly well that they wish to be part of the West, not a part of the East, in spite of the fact that Serbs have got their historic and religious connections.
Want to follow up on it as well?
Yes, coming back to the question I asked you before about the potential powder keg in that part of the world. I'm hoping to meet Sakur in 2 weeks' time, and what should I be suggesting to him that NATO should be doing now to deal with the evolving situation in the Western Balkans?
I think I would encourage him to continue with the engagement that's already going on. I mean, for example, Serbia has run I think in the last year or two 22 exercises with NATO. Serbia has only run 2 with Russia, a sort of symbolic counterbalance, and that sends a message in itself. And I think NATO's engagement, which I don't think you'll have much trouble in persuading them to continue with in the Western Balkans, through exercising, through helping rebuild armed forces, through allowing, indeed, Kosovo, for example, to have its own army. I think that's all terribly important, and will help cement our relations and help make sure that the area becomes stable and that peace isn't threatened in the region.
If we could just move on to the external side. I just want to put in one question here. This is 25 years ago, since when we've had 2 huge technological revolutions in the world, a vast energy revolution. Conditions are totally different to anything that existed even 10 years ago. And I imagine that, like almost every other corner of the planet, most people in Bosnia Herzegovina and in the whole region have their mobile telephones, have their iPads, have their systems. Kosovo is even advertising itself as a hub of electronic communication development. This is a language which wouldn't even been recognized 10 years ago. Has this vast set of world changes impacted on the region sufficiently to remove some of the pressures that you encountered all that time ago and change the attitudes of people?
I mean, in some ways, obviously it has, because everyone's doing the same social media. Everyone's aware of what's happening in the world. Everyone's aware of what the possibilities are, particularly the young people. And as you know, there's been a mass brain drain out of Bosnia because they can see a better world outside, and that better world is always in the West, not in the East. And therefore, I think the use of the social media, the use of technology has had its benefits in showing people what the possibilities are. But it also has had its disadvantages, and it's allowed people to actually leave the country, and of course thereby make it even more difficult for us to stabilise the region.
Well, really, with the outside powers, Baroness Cousins wanted to ask a question.
Come back to Russia and ask you to develop the remarks you touched on earlier. Russia's influence in the region traditionally has been relatively weak, with most of the states in the region having ambitions in the direction of the EU. I wonder whether your assessment is that this might be changing, especially in the light of Russia being the supplier of most of the energy to many of the states in the region. Would you say that Russia is in a position of being able to offer alternative military partnerships and challenge NATO?
You're right that obviously they have some leverage with their gas supplies into the Western Balkans, but I think that one can overplay that. As you know, there are other now initiatives being developed to make sure that energy can come from across the Aegean Sea, etc. And I think that the Russian influence, actually we can overreact to quite easily. I don't think, as I said before, that the army in Serbia is particularly interested in becoming part of a Russian military alliance. It's much more interested in becoming a part of NATO. As long as we keep faith with that and don't allow all these bumps on the road ahead to knock us off course, then I think that we will succeed in that mission. It would be insane for Serbia to think that it could create a little sort of post-Warsaw Pact alliance. And in going on to the economy, I mean, there is talk around of having some sort of post-Yugoslavia customs union in the region. And again, any discussion like that, prior to joining the European Union, any discussion like that only should be encouraged, because again, that's putting fences up and making it more difficult for the Russians to intervene.
What about Turkey? We've just had Mrs. Merkel's view that Turkey should give up its aspirations to join the EU, which seemed to be greeted with an odd mixture of relief and fury from Ankara. But the Turks seem to be involving themselves in the area. So are they doing damage to the present situation and stirring it up?
I don't think they are. I mean, I think they would love to reinvent the old Ottoman Empire and have their same sort of influences in their old region. But that is just wishful thinking. Again, I think that they're using the Western Balkans as some kind of a pawn in a game that's going on between the European Union and Turkey. Turkey is failing dismally to meet any of the standards that are being in terms of transparency and good governance and freedom of the media and all the other things. To meet the standards required by the European Union, I think Angela Merkel's quite right in saying that there's no hope of them joining in the foreseeable future. Their response may be trying to cause up trouble in the Balkans. But my experience of the Muslims of the Balkans, and I once had a discussion with one of the Saudi Arabian princes on the subject, who had actually been responsible for sending a mission there at the start of the Balkan Wars to find out about these European Muslims who they'd never heard of. And some imams went from Mecca and spent, I think, 6 weeks in Bosnia in particular, and went back saying these Muslims are not Muslims. They don't pray 5 times a day, they eat pork and they drink like fishes. That may not be the case today, because as we know, Saudi Arabia has put in quite a lot of effort in terms of investing in madrasas and other institutions in that country, the same as Turkey has done. But I don't think that actually they'll have much impact on people who are probably European in blood anyway, and don't have the same instincts.
I mean, I don't want to misrepresent you, but it comes over to me that the view seems to be that any involvement of any sort from Russia is either sort of mischievous or malign or both. Whereas in truth, surely it's slightly more complicated than
Absolutely.
that. I mean, not least that the involvement of the West, as you said in your opening statement, about using the West in very, very broad terms now, has not exactly been a triumphant conclusion to settling the difficulties of the Balkans. And isn't it at least true to say that we do have a common interest with the Russians in neither of us particularly want to see failed states anywhere? I mean, isn't that at least a factor that might suggest that we might have some things in common and not just, the goodies versus baddies?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. There is enormous mileage in developing the Western Balkans as common ground between us and the Russians. Even during the Balkan Wars, I was using Russia very often to try and modify the pressure that was being put on me by NATO to use more force against the Serbs, because I knew that if we went beyond a certain level of force, it would crash the peace mission anyway. And so I was very often using the Russians in the Security Council, and Lord Haney no doubt will confirm this, to try and lower the level or maintain a minimum level of force that we needed to use, not try and maximise it. And the Russians at the time were very amenable and understood instinctively what we were trying to do. And it was rather curious that someone who was actually one of better NATO soldiers should be using the Russians against NATO within 5 years of the end of the Cold War. But that's how it worked out. And I think that in a way set a trend which today we can use with the Russians. Putin is an opportunist. He's causing mischief wherever he can. He would love, after the way we humiliated Russia at the end of the Cold War, particularly at that conference I spoke about here at the 50th anniversary of NATO, where the Russian delegation, I think, effectively got up and walked out. We were being so rude about them. And they've been doing pushback ever since. But I think with the troubles they've got in Syria, where they need to come to a resolution, I think the Balkans, as a counterbalance to that, would be a very useful area in which we could talk in very objective and neutral terms with them.
Lordovi.
It's a non sequitur because I'm going back to Turkey, and you said that in your answer as regards the influence of Turkey, benign or malign, that you didn't see it as great other than some vague notion of re-establishing some framework of the old Ottoman Empire and so on. And part of the reason you gave for that was the particular nature of Islam in Bosnia-Herzegovina, very moderate form and so on. However, earlier on you talked about radicalisation inside Bosnia-Herzegovina, polarisation. And in that context, is there a greater degree of Turkish influence than might otherwise have been the case from the starting point of when you were there?
I think that's absolutely right, sir. I think that the vacuum that we, in a way, have allowed to occur in Bosnia in particular has allowed the radicalisation of the younger element in particular. As you know, Bosnians, I think Albania and Kosovo, they produce more foreign fighters in Syria than all the rest of Europe put together. So I think that there is an element of that, but that's something that we should be countering. And I know the Americans...
Tends to be, sorry?
We should be countering strenuously with our own, well, I wouldn't say propaganda, but our information policy. Because of course they are being subject to enormous, through social media, propaganda from ISIS and all the injuries and the grievances that go back to the Balkan wars. But that's something that we should take an active part in, surely. But it doesn't alter my overall view, is that the instinctive nature of the Bosnian Muslims is not exactly the same as the Wahhabis, for example.
Yes, I was a little bit doubtful, sceptical about what you said about working with the Russians, because I'm not sure that you've taken sufficiently into account that the Russia of 1990s, which was indeed sometimes reasonably helpful, is not the Mr. Putin's Russia.
That's true.
And I'm not sure that Putin's objectives are the same as, say, Yeltsin's were, when Yeltsin gave very high priority to working with the West on a whole range of international problems, of which this was one. I would be sceptical, frankly, because I think that the Putin policy is really one that you described in an earlier answer, namely of troublemaking, basically destabilizing, making life difficult for NATO, the Americans, us, the other Europeans, etc. I don't quite see the scope for cooperation myself, but perhaps you do.
I think, Lord Haney, I'm probably slightly more optimistic than you. I mean, you and I dealt often with Sergei Lavrov, who's still in business. And he, in a way, represents the sort of continuity between Yeltsin and Putin. I think Putin is himself a realist, and that if we suggested to him, as somebody on your committee previously said, that an unstable, fragmented, and possibly a violent the Western Balkans would not be in Russia's interest, I'm sure he would have to agree with you. So I think there are probably, one could try a démarche with him and see how he went. And particularly Sergei Lavrov would be a very interesting person to talk to on that basis.
Now, a final question on the other enigma, which of course is Washington and not Moscow, Lord Purvis.
So, Michael, you mentioned before the reduced budgets from the US in the region. You said that would potentially leave a vacuum that could be filled by Russia. Is this, in your view, a bump on the road, as you said, with regards to going forward, and our strategic interests will continue to be aligned with the United States, or are you detecting that there is quite a shift from the US, of which we will have to have a more clear separation from our position with them?
Well, so I think I'd lend myself to your latter position. There is, as long as President Trump remains in power, a definite shift. He is, by instinct, an isolationist. He'll respond to external issues such as North Korea, but his main ambition is to disengage and make America great again from within before he starts getting involved in foreign expeditions again. And so I fear that we may have to pick up the tab or fill the vacuum, to change the metaphor, that is left by President Trump and the administration.
And will this primarily be with other NATO countries, in your view, or is it finding some form of post-Brexit?
I missed that.
Is it within the NATO community that would be the priority for that, or is it in some form of post-Brexit new relationship with the EU? Primarily, where would you think that the...
Well, I think it should be both, I'm afraid. That we should support the EU in its initiatives. I mean, as somebody said, Brussels can't go it alone, and therefore I think they need every help they can get, and I think NATO in the same way, you know, needs our support and encouragement.
Well, I think that's it's not a conclusion, of course, but it's an end point that when you talk of picking up tabs and filling in vacuums, that is where our work really starts, as to what the possibilities are. So, Michael, it's fascinating to hear your wisdom on the whole scene, and we're very grateful to you for really, you've been a sort of introduction to it for us, and we'd like to thank you very much for coming before us. Sparing time to come before the committee as we try and grapple with this long-standing question of the Balkans, and our study we've labelled actually Beyond Brexit, the UK and the Balkans. So you were High Representative for Bosnia, as a governor for 4 years, I think, which is a long stretch, and you're at your fingertips. I think you've got more knowledge and understanding and sensitivity of what's happening there now than many people, and we'd like to share your views. So can I start with the sort of obvious and main question, which is, what about the UK and the Balkans today? Is there a sufficient level of interest here? Do we understand what is happening, what all the dangers are, and how can we make good and make effective in that area? So if we could start on that sort of aspect of the overall theme, it'd be very helpful.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for asking me here. When you say I've got more understanding, I suspect slightly less than Arminka Helic, but who's been a great advisor and helper to me, and I suspect that her judgments on these things will be one that you will want to listen to, because I know that she's very close to the situation, and I believe that over her time with the last Foreign Secretary, or was it the Foreign Secretary before that, I lose touch, did a great deal of work there. So it's a pleasure, and I may disagree with some of the things which Sir Michael Rose said, but he's absolutely right in saying this is a most timely inquiry, I think extremely important. As for the United Kingdom, I think the straight answer to your question is no. I don't think there is a huge engagement in the Balkans in the United Kingdom. I don't think it's terribly widely known about, and in the face of other problems facing the world at present, why should it be? I think it was very much at the forefront of everybody's mind throughout the 1990s. I remember in my times visiting Bosnia and Sarajevo during the war, and later on as a High Representative, whenever I went to a foreign capital and spoke to foreign secretaries, I mentioned Banja Luka, and they knew exactly where it was, or Sanski Most, and because that had been part of their, as it were, upbringing. And I suppose that's now, slightly with the exception of Mr. Lavrov, worked its way out of the system. I was very conscious when I was there that Bosnia was not at the top of the international agenda, but quite close to it. You saw that in the seniority of the diplomats, representatives of the various Peace Implementation Council members who would turn up to regular meetings in Sarajevo. By the time I left, those which had started off as senior people in the Foreign Offices diminished down to much more junior ones. So that's a fairly fair indication of how this has gone off the boil. Certainly, when William Hague was Foreign Secretary, this was, indeed it was, I think it featured in the coalition agreement as one of the key areas of foreign policy we wanted to concentrate on. William did. In the end, however, I suspect that we couldn't develop the kind of policies that Foreign Secretary Hague would like to have followed, because our European neighbours, and perhaps especially at that time Berlin and Paris, wouldn't provide the energy behind that. And in the end, I suspect a calculation was made to say that it wasn't worth the expenditure of political capital to move them on other issues in order to devote to this. That gives you, I think, another indication. So, off the boil, not of great interest, and low down on the international agenda. Should it be? No, it certainly shouldn't. It's always been, Bismarck famously said that the Balkans weren't worth the bones of a Pomeranian grenadier. Well, I think we've proved that that was not true in the 20th century, and indeed in presently. It remains the interface on that crucial, as it were, fault line between what we used to call Christendom and the Muslim world. It remains a potential bridge. Ali Izetbegovic, the leader of the Bosnian Muslims during the Balkan War, used to say, I'm a European and a Muslim, and I see no contradiction between the two. And that is true. Michael Rose mentioned that. And therefore its capacity to act as an essential bridge, both adhering to European values on the one hand and a Muslim nation on the other, is, I think, crucially strategically important to us. I think the downside of this is also one that you should look at, because if it is the case, and certainly it's my view that we might be tracking towards it for lack of political will to do anything else, that de facto, in effect, as a result of what happens through amnesia or apathy or lack of attention, Bosnia breaks up, whether legally or not, and we are left, therefore, with the European Union being the unwitting deliverer of the policies of Karadzic and Mladic, with the Bosnian enclave, 40% of the population of Bosnia, as an enclave, cut off from its surrounding, start off from the Republic of Srpska, then I think we'd be in a very difficult position indeed. And it remains the case that if you look at the recruiting sergeants for ISIS, for instance, you will find that Bosnia and the Bosnian War is high up in there. This is important to them, and it ought to be more important to us. My final point, I suppose, before we get on to your questions, Mr. Chairman, is I think one of the mistakes that we have made, we have invested political will, treasure, and forces in Bosnia to bring it to the point where I think it could make a track towards a country that could be an accession country of the European Union. Broadly speaking, it happens to coincide with the time I left, but I don't think the two are necessarily connected, in 2006, and that we sort of left it there, and the job was unfinished, and it remains unfinished business. I think one of the strategic mistakes we made was lack of the strategic patience to see it through to a proper, stable conclusion. And the second was, and it occurred under Solana in particular, with my successor, Miroslav Lajčák, who was then High Representative, Javier Solana took the view that Kosovo was the central problem. Sort out Kosovo, and the rest of the Balkans will be all right. I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding. And basically the policy followed by the European Union in 2006-2007, from which I think the current difficulties stem, was keep Bosnia quiet at any price. Pay any price to keep Bosnia quiet. In that case it was police reform, in order we can sort out Kosovo. I don't believe Kosovo is the the fuse that leads to the Balkans bomb. I think Kosovo is a bit like Schleswig-Holstein. Time will sort it out. You remember Gladstone once was asked what was the problem with, what was the answer to the Schleswig-Holstein question. His answer was 3 people remember, 1 is dead, the other's mad, and I'm the 3rd, and I've forgotten. It was time that sorted it out. I think it's Bosnia, which, if Bosnia goes bad, the rest of the Balkans goes bad. And that's for that reason, I think, the lack of attention to this problem is dangerous. Now, I finished by saying this. Do I therefore mean that I think Bosnia will go back to war? No. I don't think that's the most likely outcome. There is neither the will for it, although there are rumours of people training in the forest like there were in '92. I think the fact that there is now a state army responsible to the presidency, a professional army, is a bulwark against that. I don't think anybody wants to go back to war. The mood may be quite nervous as it was in '92, but the intention, the desire to go to war, which is certainly evident in '92, I don't think is there now. But the situation is so febrile, Mr. Chairman, that I cannot entirely tell you with confidence that conflict and violence would not be the outcome if, for instance, some event like a hand grenade was thrown into the mosque in Doboju on Friday prayers. The consequence of that would be, I think, unpleasant. So I think the most likely outcome from the present policy is that Bosnia and Herzegovina remains a sort of black hole of corruption, dystopia, lack of ability to govern itself properly, a sort of festering sore, which we haven't the energy to put right, and are prepared to tolerate the consequences of continuing in the centre of what is one of Europe's most unstable regions.
Well, that's very, very full of insights and reflection on, I mean, this question, how febrile, as you say, it's very hard to assess whether it will go back to something in the nature of an explosion or merely continual festering sore, in your words. Lord Balm, if you wanted to pursue this issue.
Yes. You described the Dayton Peace Accords as, quotes, a superb agreement to end a war, but a very bad agreement to make a state. And much later in the summer of this year, David Harland wrote of it that the machinery of government established at Dayton is cumbersome and remains unreformed and financed by unsustainable levels of debt, etc. Is a reform of Dayton a fundamental in getting the major solution to the problems that we face?
It is.
And
it
how
is.
would
I mean,
you
look,
suggest
Dayton
we
had,
go ahead?
Dayton had all sorts of stupidities, infelicities, but I cannot think of a single compromise, untidy and uncomfortable as they were, made in Dayton, which was not necessary to create the beginning of peace, the context for a peace. Nor can I think of any single Bosnian I've ever met who would not have preferred an untidy and ragged, ragbag and bobtail, perhaps even peace, than the continuation of that war. It was the right thing at the time. Bosnia, I think, has gone through 2 phases. The first is stabilization, and the second is state building. Dayton was absolutely right for stabilization. Perhaps the only compromise I think we didn't have to make was to pretend that there were 3 languages instead of 1, Bosnian, Serbian and Croat. It's the same language, and that's allowed a certain degree of linguistic nationalism to grow up, which was but the others, I think, were all compromises that were necessary. It was a brilliant agreement, in my view. I think the moment when you moved from stabilization to state building coincided with my arrival in Bosnia in 2002. And I remember the first speech I gave to the Bosnian parliament said that Dayton had to be our floor, but could not be our ceiling. We had to build on Dayton. Now, the problem was that nobody has the power to go beyond Dayton. Nobody can impose that. You have to, my mandate there was I had to act within Dayton. So if it was the case that I wanted to go beyond Dayton, which I did, I had to persuade the Bosnians that that was what they had to do. And we went beyond Dayton in a number of key areas. We went beyond Dayton in establishing a single army, in taking the 3 intelligence services and making them one and making them responsible to Parliament and making them indeed a model of, I think, what intelligence services legislation, in creating single customs services out of 3. All these went beyond Dayton, and in creating probably in 2 years, by the way, which is a world record, from a completely dysfunctional sales tax system, introduced a whole new VAT system which would provide sustainable funding for the Bosnian government. All of those things went beyond Dayton. In all of them, I could not use my bond powers as a high representative. I had to use my political persuasion to persuade the Bosnian governments, Republic of Srpska, the Federation, and the Bosnian state to accept these. And they did. I mean, I have to say, it used a lot of pressure, and you could hear a great deal of cracking of arms from as far away as Brussels. And in the process of doing that, I used extensively my two colleagues on the European Union, Chris Patton, who was the Commissioner, and George Robertson, who was then the Secretary General of NATO. We used those, pretty brutally to make sure. But in the end, the Bosnians understood that this is what they had to do in order to join the European Union, in order to join the Atlantic institutions in Brussels. And that was very important. Now, the moment the European Union lost the will to use that power, not the bond powers vested in the High Representative, but the political powers that came from Brussels, to be able to move them forward, they reverted to the normal fisiparious tendencies. And there's a reason for that, Mr. Chairman. I hope I don't go on too long. I have a sort of theory that in unfinished wars, in frozen conflicts, actually what happens is that the nomenclatura who ran the war immediately translate themselves into running the political situation afterwards. And they do not change the aims of the war, they simply pursue them through the means of politics. And therefore our rush to have lots of elections simply did not create a democracy, because none of the other institutions of a democracy were there. We had to create, I had to create those, and I went there. Single judiciary, and beginnings of a free press, etc., and a decent constitution. And so if you do not continue that political pressure until the generation who ran the war are leached out of the political system, by the way, that's beginning to happen in Northern Ireland, and that's why I've got a chance there, you have to keep that political pressure on. And so in 2006, when I left, and what I was regarded as an excessively muscular High Representative, I think it would be fair to say, and the European Union adopted far too prematurely the policy of local determination, and simply took their hands off the guiding tiller. Everything went back, everybody reasserted their policies. And so what's happened since then is that there has been a gradual unstitch. I have to say, Cathy Ashton, with whom I have a great regard and good friend and high respect for her, I'm afraid to say that over her time as the European High Representative of Foreign Affairs, every single one of the steps that we made in those days, not just me but my two predecessors, High Representative, have been allowed to unravel back to a process of close to dystopian government again. And that's very regrettable, I have to say. Now, how do we reverse that? You cannot reverse it unless the European Union adopts the will to drive this process and to use the leverage it has to drive it forward. And relating to the question that Sir Michael Rose asked, that is going to always better happen if it's an Atlantic relationship. If the European Union twins up with the United States to drive that process, they form an irresistible force that can make things happen in Bosnia. We have chosen not to use that because we've chosen not to have the political will to make it happen, and the consequence is that Bosnia now is tracking not forwards but backwards.
Well, I think we must come further to the American role now in a moment, but Baroness Hellick, do you want to pursue this theme?
I don't know where to start. There's so much there. Thank you very much. I was meaning to ask, but maybe you have answered these questions, what, in your view, are the major challenges for the state of Bosnia? But another thing that I keep on encountering is each time I listen to the High Representative, Ms. Mogherini, she gives sweet words about her attachment and her to the Balkans, her understanding and her ambition to bring the Balkans, and not a single one of these 6 countries should be left behind. But every time you scratch behind the surface, there is no plan. There's no plan, there's no political will, there's no unity, there's no strategy. I mean, it is actually shameful to keep on repeating this every couple of months whenever there is a meeting of the Foreign Affairs Council, etc. And I just wondered whether I'm too critical, or whether you see something that I am unable to see in these words, and potentially that there is something behind that it actually can produce a substantial plan and a strategy behind it to implement it?
Baroness Helic, there's a great Bosnian phrase which goes "da komčet setni krava," which means my neighbour's cow is dead. That makes me happy. The word thrawn may well be Scottish and Northern Irish, but it's also Bosnian. And they love it when that happens. And there is, by the way, a very much ruder version of that, which, since I won't repeat it here, otherwise I'd make Baroness Helic blush. The Bosnians love extremely rude proverbs. So there is that natural tendency for dysfunctionality. It's very Northern Irish in a way. Forgive me I'm a Northern Irishman, so I can say that. So I have no doubt what the key to Bosnia is to make this right, and that's to create a functional state. For as long as the state wastes its vast money, not vast money, very limited money, on this vast institution, with 10 prime ministers and 10 ministers of the interior, because all the cantons have one, and for as long as it wastes its money, it cannot spend that money on building loyalty to its citizens. Loyalty from citizens to the state does not, I'm afraid to say, come from flags and anthems. It comes from the fact that the state delivers to the citizens the things the citizens want to have, which make them loyal to the state. The flag and the anthem comes after that. If you don't have a dysfunctional state, you cannot have citizens who want to commit to that state, and they'd rather go and join another state, as the Serbs do want to join Belgrade, and the Croats and Herzegovina want to join Zagreb. Making a functional state, able to deliver jobs, a reasonable economy, we got it growing when I was there, a decent education system, it's exactly the same as in our own countries. And for as long as Bosnia is dysfunctional, it will not be able to deliver. Now, how do you make Bosnia dysfunctional? Well, the answer is, I'm afraid Britain isn't a model. Belgium, I think, is much more a model for modern dystopian states than Britain is. It's highly decentralized, where you pay a certain price of inefficiency in governments in order to hold together the very difficult, as it were, ethnic and religious mixes. I think it's a light-level state that has significant devolution, but I think it's a state that at the state level is able to relate to the equivalents in the European Union. So the Minister of Agriculture from Bosnia can do a deal with the Minister of Agriculture from Britain in the Council of Ministers. That's what you need to create. So is there a plan for that? No, I don't think there is. I mean, constitutional reform has been tried, which they didn't call it that because that sends up maroons ahead of the time, but the functional reform of Bosnia is crucial to be able to create that. And the truth is there isn't a plan for that. And if there isn't the will behind that plan to make it work. And the will does not lie, I'm afraid, with High Representative Mogherini. It lies with European capitals. If the European capitals will provide the will behind that, the Foreign Secretary, the High Representative of Foreign Affairs can do it. Chris Patton did it brilliantly. By the way, what I did before I went there was spend 9 months coming up with a plan. Then I took the plan around each of the key European capitals and got their agreement at a high level that they would give me the political will to drive that plan through. That was then developed through the European Union. So unless you have all of those systems in place, even if there was a plan, absent the support from European capitals, that's not going to go through. If Europe wants to solve the Balkans, it ought to, for reasons we've said, then it needs to develop in its capitals the political will to engage and drive that process through. If they could do that, it can be done. Absent that, it can't.
Baroness Cousins. So you're looking surprised. My thinking is we want to come more to what the UK can do in all this at the moment.
Yes.
But we got quite a confused message from Sir Michael as to whether they're moving away from Europe towards Russia, or they're moving away from Russia towards Europe.
I must say, Mr. Chairman, if you'd like me to take that one on, I very much agreed with Hannay on that. I thought Michael Rose was wrong. He was talking about the Russia that was, not the Russia that is. And I remember going to see Lavrov in Moscow on Bosnia on several occasions. And the Russians indeed supported very much that we did in the PIK in those days. The Russia today absolutely does not. I don't think there is any desire. I mean, Russia's interest in the Balkans is to give us as much mischief as possible. So Michael Rose said they didn't want a failed state. They're perfectly happy to see failed states in the Balkans because it's our failed states, with the exception of Montenegro. Montenegro is 600,000 strong, and it's basically been bought by the Russian mafia. That's who owns Montenegro today.
Sorry, Baroness Cousin, I took your words from you. That was what you wanted to ask, wasn't it? That sort of thing.
So, I mean, if I could just very briefly continue. I'm very clear that Russia's interest is to give us problem in our own backyard so that we don't have enough energy to do the things that, you know, we could otherwise do, for instance, in Ukraine. They've lent Republika Srpska money, not very much, not nearly as much, in order to make it to show that it can. I'll just tell a little story. There was an occasion where one of the Bosnian politicians, or a Serb actually, came to see me and he said, because I was pushing the European Union, he said, "Oh, Paddy, we can always go to Bosnia, to Russia. We don't have to go to Brussels because we can go to Moscow." And I said, "Tell you what, meet me at 6 tomorrow morning in the square outside the presidency in Sarajevo." He said, "Why?" I said, "Just meet me there." So we met at 6 o'clock and we took a little walk around Sarajevo very early in the morning, and we went first to the German embassy. Great big queue all the way around the street, back into the central square from the German embassy. What are they there for? Waiting for visas. So I said, "Come on, Laden, let's go along and see the Austrian embassy." So we went to the Austrian embassy. Great big queue all the way around, waiting for visas. And I said, "Come on, let's go and have a look at the Russian embassy." Completely empty. Nobody wanted to go to Russia. The truth is that Russia will make mischief for us there, but it's not, I think, its interest to Russia, probably to Erdogan too these days, though I'm bound to say Turkey played an extremely positive role up until Erdogan, extremely positive role, and across the ethnicities. But I think their interest now is just to make things difficult for us, and insofar as we leave a vacuum where we don't have a plan and the will to enforce it, we give them an opportunity to do so. I beg your pardon now.
Sorry, Baroness Cousin, it's your turn.
I was going to come on to what the UK should be doing or could be doing to help in the effort you've just described that is so necessary to create a functional state. And in the post-Brexit context, how can the UK use more effectively its membership of other international bodies, such as the UN, NATO, OSCE, and so on, to help promote that, perhaps in particular in helping to tackle corruption and crime, which are two of the key elements preventing an effective functional state. So how would you describe the UK's role in the region post-Brexit, especially as part of all those other organisations that we will remain members of?
I'm sorry, I had to give you a bleak answer, hugely diminished. Look, the things that make Bosnia move is Washington and Brussels. Why? Because Washington is the key to them putting their armed forces in a position where they could join NATO, and Brussels is the person who delivers the soft power that enables you to reform your judicial system, create a customs service and so on. And by the way, has a huge amount of resources going in. I mean, Brussels has more institutions of leverage in Bosnia and Herzegovina than it has in any other country in the world. It has a high representative still equipped with the bomb power, who happens to be European Union Special Representative as well, responsible to Brussels. It has a huge police mission there, and it has a huge, in per capita terms, aid program. People used to come to me and say, "Well, Paddy, you have to do this, because if you don't do it, we're not going to give you the aid." And Chris Patton would give me, "Are you blackmailing me?" I said, "No, this is our taxpayers' money. We're not going to give it for you to do nothing." But if you don't have that leverage, you can't move things forward. Now, are there things Britain could do? Well, if Britain remained in the European Union, it could promote the idea that we have a coordinated European policy towards the Balkans. By the way, it has to be a regional policy. You can't have penny packet policies in Bosnia. If I wanted to get things done in Bosnia with the Serbs, I rang Belgrade and spoke to my friends there. If I wanted to get things done with Croatia, I rang Zagreb. And I made it very clear that I was always very close to them, because they're the things. So it has to be a regional policy. If you did a European regional policy and Britain was prepared to expend the political will to make that work, you can change the Balkans. But Britain acting alone simply cannot do that. And so we remove ourselves, it seems to me, from the primary power to make things happen. Now, does that mean there's nothing we can do? No. Of course we can provide technical support for anti-corruption. Of course, we can provide technical support to help the economy work better. These are all things, but they're all things which many other nations can do as well. And I don't think we elevate ourselves beyond the position of Japan, perhaps, which is a member of the Peace Implementation Council, except we're able to do it with a greater degree of resource. But if we remove ourselves from the European Union, I think we move ourselves from the process of having our hands on the primary levers to change things. I'm sorry to be depressing about that. Britain was a huge support to me, but because I could get things done in Brussels through London, that made a difference in Bosnia.
I think I rather rudely cut you out, and I apologise for that. I think the chairman was making a muddle, but would you like to pursue this point, or do you feel it's being answered?
The question has effectively been answered, but I would like to ask a different question, if I may, about funding. Looking at the figures for funding, we seem to be funding Bosnia at a much lower level than the other ex-Yugoslavian republics, whereas I think from the evidence we've heard, it should be getting far more in the way of EU funding.
Yes, I agree with that. Although, you mean we, in this case, the European Union?
Well, I meant the EU.
Yes.
Yeah.
Of course, the reason for that is, Croatia, I think, has been a really important model, because I could always point to Croatia and say, look, this is what they've done. They put themselves in a position to join the European Union, and the accession process, that's what they get in return. If you put yourself in that position, so that was a huge assistance to us. The difficulty is that Bosnia has failed to make those reforms in the main case in order to become a proper accession country, receiving all those funds with the largesse that others have done. And I suspect that's the reason. And although there are some, not least in Brussels, who say, never mind, let's not worry, let's just make them accession countries. And let them pretend that they... Chris Patton had a lovely phrase. He used to say, the problem with all the Balkans, by the way, is they pretend to do what we ask them and we pretend to believe them. And that's absolutely right. And it diminishes the power of Brussels. I'm quite hard line on this. So if the Bosnians, if the people in Bosnia or Montenegro or Serbia don't make the changes that are required to bring them up to the standards of the European Union, I'm not sure we should be giving them money. I think that's much better.
Macedonia is getting 5 times.
Yes, it probably is, but then I think Macedonia is very close to a civil war, and I can understand why you might want to. I mean, but by the way, there is a problem in Bosnia, and maybe this is what you're referring to. I remember saying to my good friends amongst the Bosnians that I thought that they were being killed by their silence. That was the silence of the Bosnian lambs, because the Serbs could do almost anything, and we would respond to their threats. A very dangerous thing to do. That was the cause of the '92 war. And when I was there, we refused to respond to Serbian threats. And so the Bosnians just sort of sit there and say, well, it doesn't matter very much, but it actually does. So I think that's one of the problems. Sorry, I'm becoming a little bit... does that answer your question effectively? Well, this is answer your question enough. Sorry, am I being gloomy here? I think I probably am.
I suspect there isn't a real answer. Yes.
The problem is...
Lord Reid, we're going over these issues again and again, but they do merit deeper examination. Lord Reid, you wanted to press on what we do.
The particular question has been addressed from a couple of areas. What could the UK do? But reflecting on thank you for sharing your experiences and your wisdom on this. Reflecting on what you've said, it seems to me you've stressed not only the need for internal reconciliation to the extent that you have some form of overall state in Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as a lot of devolution, but you've also at various times referred to the external structures, and you started off by saying we're at the interface between Christendom and Islam, the Ottoman Empire, then you had Yugoslavia, and what I'm interested in really is, yes, the European Union can use the carrots and sticks to try and enhance internal reconciliation. But to what extent is it also a positive framework, in the sense that Ireland and Britain, both being members of the European Union, facilitated a much closer relationship, as well as facilitating the Good Friday Agreement, because of the backstop of both everyone being members of the European Union. And I'm interested to what extent, therefore, over the longer period, the integration of the countries of the Western Balkans into Europe, as well, of course, as into NATO, but I'm primarily interested in the European Union, is a facilitating framework to bring about internal reconciliation.
Absolutely.
And therefore, presumably, we are removing ourselves from that element.
No, precisely. Exactly. I remember once somebody saying to me, oh, the Balkans have always been at war. Actually, it was Douglas Hurd. And I came back, I think, in '93, and I've been visiting, I've been in the siege Serbia, and I came back and said, we've got to intervene. And he said, no, the Balkans have always been at war. And I thought, I was really surprised, great admirer of Douglas Hurd's, because I just thought he was a fabulous man, and he knew his history very well. I said, Douglas, it's not the Europeans have always been at war. It's us who've always been at war. For 1,000 years, the countries of Europe. There's been far more wars, far more regular wars in Europe than there ever have been in the Balkans. And we have slaughtered each other by the millions. And yet we found our way out of that because we were able to cope with those nationalisms that had been so destructive by the overarching framework of the European Union. And exactly the same applies in Bosnia. They are not more dedicated to war and fissupariousness than we are. They really are not. And by the way, this business of integration will come if you get a successful economy. There's no difficulty about integration. If you go to... the people are perfectly happy to integrate, most of them. Obviously they carry the scars of war and it'll take time for that to leach away. But there's not a difficulty about integration. The difficulty is driven by the politicians at the top who want to preserve the specificities of their ethnicity because it helps them to control power. And the parallel is exactly what you've said, John. It's Northern Ireland. It's exactly what, did the people of Northern Ireland want to get together? Yes, of course they did, long before their politicians. But their politicians, it was in their interest to maintain those. And that's exactly the case in Bosnia. So Europe is indeed the overarching framework in which this goes. It's the only one. My view, and I used to say it to them very frequently, the only way you can have economic prosperity, a future for your children, and peace is to join the institutions, the Atlantic institutions of Brussels. And it was the most powerful argument that I had, and it remains the case. I give you this undertaking. If you can create a functional state and a growing economy in Bosnia and Herzegovina, integration will take care of itself.
Yes, just following that up. And I know it's a little bit academic, since for reasons which both you and I regret, our influence on the accession process for Balkan countries to the European Union is modest, to put it mildly. Do you think that the accession remains viable, both in the Brussels end and in the end of each of the component countries, Albania, Montenegro, Macedonia, Serbia, Kosovo, Bosnia, and so on? So looking wider than Bosnia. Do you think the process, which may take a very long time, because as I think you rightly said, we shouldn't play games and pretend that they're up to the Copenhagen criteria when they're not, do you think the process is a viable one? In the countries, for example, are they tiring of that process? Are they thinking of something else? Or, and the Brussels end, when this lamentable president of the Commission, who said such unwise things about the accession of any new country, passes on, perhaps there is an opportunity for the European Union to resume a serious policy of accession. What do you think about all that?
I think it all depends on the question on what Europe will do. An accession policy becomes viable if it's a policy we are prepared to pursue with purpose and political will behind it. I used to say that the unity and peace of Bosnia rested on two forces. One, for a bit, was the, as it were, muscular power of the Peace Implementation Council expressed through the Bomb Pass, the High Representative, if he chose to use them and was prepared to do so. And the second was the magnetic pull of Brussels. If those two were in place, then Bosnia would continue to move forward. The sadness is that the magnetic pull of Brussels has massively diminished. Most Bosnians know that they're not entirely going to be welcome. They're going to be referenda in France if they join. That what many of them will say, Paddy, don't fool me. I know perfectly well that we're more important to Europe than Europe is to us. Well, it wasn't true, but Europe behaved in such a way that it looked like it, because if you set a series of standards, they didn't achieve them, but Europe pretended they did, then its seriousness in driving the process forward immediately vanished, which is, why I became quite unpopular, particularly amongst the Serbs, for just insisting that the standards were adhered to. So if Europe has the will, this is possible to do. But if Europe, the way I used to try to explain it to Europeans is, look, this is not an expansion of Europe. This is unfinished business inside the outer circuit, the outer parameters of the Europe. This is your unfinished business. Well, however much I said that, it didn't look like that when it was delivered in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So, yes, I think this can be done. I would say on three conditions. Europe develops the plan and the political will to put it into effect. The second is that the United States is prepared to throw its weight behind that, albeit that Europe will have to say it will carry the burden, but it is there to provide that support. And the third is that we see this not as penny packet policies, which we have at present, one for Montenegro, one for Kosovo, one for Macedonia, one for Serbia, one for Croatia, but you see it as an overarching regional policy in which you can play the leverages. If you want to solve the problem of fissuperiousness with Mirko, with the Prime Minister of the Republic of Serbia, how can I forget him? Milorad Dodik. He has a picture of me on his wall that he sticks pins into, by the way. Some Liberal Democrats do that as well, you're quite right, Jim. If you want to get Milorad Dodik to do something, you will not get it done by bullying him from Brussels. You get it done by getting his friends in Belgrade. And you then say to Belgrade, as part of your accession process, we are not going to accept you to be a member of the European Union unless you pursue European Union policy in Bosnia and Herzegovina, actively ensuring that this is not allowed to break up. And if they do that, then you get things. So those three conditions: Europe has a plan and the political will to drive it. Secondly, that the United States is prepared to play some role in that, because they're regarded as the people with the muscle, given the history of the Balkans. I'm not surprised. And thirdly, that you have a regional policy and play the interlinkages. If that happens, you can begin to move the Balkans forward.
All those conditions look a bit remote, don't they?
Yes.
No more accession, says Mr. Juncker. Americans not interested.
Yes. I mean, I don't know if you're picking up, or maybe I shouldn't say this. I don't know, we're on the record, obviously. I've heard some quite interesting stuff that the Canadians are now thinking of this. If it is right that Trudeau is thinking about an Atlantic, a sort of Canadian-European axis to drive forward some stuff in the Balkans, I think that's quite a significant new step. I hear on the grapevine that there's some interest in this. Now, is Canada a replacement for the United States? Obviously not. But I think if Canada and the European Union were genuinely interested in making things happen in the Balkans, then you may be quite close to the ingredients of a package that could actually drive it forward. I don't know if any of you picked up on that, but there's some people quite actively talking about it. I've heard it from Monty.
Really, this is such a central theme. I know Baroness Smith wants to come in on this precise point. Lord Joplin does as well. Can I ask you, Lord Joplin, just to wait until Baroness Smith has pursued it? Could you just wait a second? Because I think we're so central on Brexit and how we get out of it and so on. or stay
yes, get out of it.
And then Lord Joplin after that.
Well, assuming we're not going to get out of Brexit, we've been talking a lot about the EU, and as you've already suggested, Lord Ashdown, there are problems in any case about the Balkans pretending to be ready and the EU pretending to believe them, as happened in the Big Bang enlargement in 2004, which in many ways is part of the problem.
Absolutely.
But if the UK is leaving the European Union, what role do you think the UK can play alongside the European Union, and to what extent should we be trying to have a policy that is as close as possible to the EU? Should we be having that as part of the demands for where the UK is going in terms of its post-Brexit foreign policy strategy?
Yes. The answer to your question is yes, I think. I mean, if the European Union isn't part of the... Britain isn't part of the European Union, it will not have access to those levers in the way it otherwise would. But it seems to me an entirely right foreign policy for us to follow, that in the Balkans, we and Brussels should be ad idem in what we're trying to pursue, that we add our weight to theirs. And I think that's the right policy to pursue. And if that is, if you can develop some kind of transatlantic framework of that, albeit with Ottawa rather than Washington under the present dispensation, then I think that's helpful. Yes, I think we should see ourselves as lending weight to the European Union's policy, if we could just determine what that was. The sadness is that since we're not in the European Union, we don't have an ability to be able to influence that policy and change it, which I think is necessary.
Lord Joplin, did you want to come in on the end of this?
Our two sessions this morning have been dominated by Bosnia, and we haven't heard very much. We've heard a little, but I think I'd like to hear more. With regard to the influence of Serbia in all this, you mentioned Serbia. You recall that it was Serbia who was very much at the centre of starting the war in the 90s. And it is the influence of Serbia which contributes to the Banja people who make Bosnia almost ungovernable, and the Serbians, again, their influence in Kosovo, in the northern enclave there, makes that country almost ungovernable. To what extent do you think that Serbia is a malign influence in the Western Balkans? And then coming to the figures which we've been given of EU funding, where Serbia appears to get almost 2.5 times the amount of support of any of the other single countries, 1,500 million euros compared with the next highest at 664. Do you think that, to what extent is Serbia a malign influence? And are we not sufficiently strident with them? And is it because of their flirtation with the Russians? Michael Rose reminded us that the Serbs have had very many more military exercises with NATO than with the Russians. Yeah. I think it was 22 to 2, if I recall. But I would like to hear a little bit more about the role of Serbia.
The answer is, Serbia has always been, you remember the 19th century policy, Britain and France always saw Serbia as the absolute key to the Balkans. And they are the largest nation, they are an extremely gifted nation, they too are very thrown, of course, they have all sorts of problems, but they are the greatest nation of the Balkans, without a shadow of a doubt. And Croatia would disagree with that, obviously. So if you bring Serbia on board, if you can get them through this process, I think you've created a huge impetus on the rest of Europe, the Balkans to follow. Insofar as, let me draw a parallel with Northern Ireland, because I think John is so right. There are so many parallels that used to annoy. I sort of drew attention to them, but as an Irishman, I'm entitled to. The truth was that Northern Ireland was such a basket case that Dublin actually never wanted it. Northern Ireland, we would say it wanted a united Ireland, but it absolutely didn't want to take on board Northern Ireland in its original case. The same is true of Republika Srpska. I mean, Republika Srpska, the Serbs do not want Republika Srpska to be part of Serbia. They treat, by the way, the word Bosniak has come to mean a Bosnian Muslim, but the original meaning of Bosniak was somebody who came from Bosnia, and it was a derogatory term. And in Belgrade, if you went to Belgrade, they used the word Bosniak in its derogatory hic primitivno meaning for the people who came from Banja Luka, Serbs though they were. So the truth is that just as Northern Ireland, Dublin's role in Northern Ireland was important because of what it played out in terms of Dublin's domestic politics, Banja Luka, Republika Srpska, can always be an extra string to the bow of a Serbian nationalist seeking election in Belgrade, because they can talk about the evil that has been done and taking our fellow Serbs away from them. So it is important to them, but only in terms of the internal national politics. I don't think they've got any intention of doing anything, which is reincorporating Republika Srpska into Belgrade. So are they a malign influence? Well, insofar as nationalists are in charge of Serbia and are going to be malign, they're going to exercise that poison in Republika Srpska too. But generally speaking, I don't think Serbia wants to be particularly malign towards Republika Srpska. I don't think that, a little bit of mischief here and there. If they're going to play Moscow, why would you not play Moscow if it drives up your leverage with Brussels? Why would you not have a military exercise with the Russians once in a while to remind NATO and to give you some more leverage there? Why would you not do that? Serbs are perfectly capable of playing that card, and they do. But I don't think we should regard that as being long-term intent. Now, all that being said, nevertheless, you're absolutely right. I don't object to the idea that the European Union gives Serbia a lot more money than elsewhere, because I think it's that important. I do object to the fact that it's not attached to very strong conditionality. You said, should we be using more conditionality for that money? Absolutely so. And I think we should be saying to Belgrade, you play a role, we expect you actively to play a role in Bosnia consistent with the European Union's policies in Bosnia, which is to create a functional state. So that's the leverage we should be using. There was a moment when, because of a failure to adhere to Hague Tribunal conditions, I had to do the very difficult thing, horribly frightening, I can tell you, of getting rid of a directly elected Serb president, asking him to come and see me and saying, look, I'm sorry, I'm removing you from... He'd just been elected directly by the people of Republika Srpska. And I can tell you it was a very frightening thing to have to do. He's a man called Mirko Šarović, who's and a man I greatly admire, by the way, as well. But he was not doing what was necessary to catch war criminals, and that was an international crime. And before I did that, obviously, I made sure I had Chris Patton and George Robertson lined up. But I also rang my friends in Belgrade and said, look, I'm about to do this. There was a man called Svilanovic, you may remember him, a very fine foreign minister. And I rang him and said, look, I'm just going to have to do it. And he said, Paddy, you'll have terrible problems. And I said, look, I know you will. And I'm going to have to criticize you and show you. Yeah, I know you will. But I had to make sure that he wasn't going to push the envelope further than that before I would feel able to act. So that's what you have to do. You must play those leverages. And the only one we've got, absent the bomb powers, absent 60,000 troops in S4 in Bosnia, absent a political military force that can drive the process forward, is your conditionality on the amount of money you give. It's the only thing you've got.
Out of time, and it's been absolutely fascinating. I know, Baroness Hellett, you've got one point on the figures you just wanted quickly to make.
Yes,
everyone else wants to ask questions.
Hilton has asked, and I thought, just if I may, top up to what Lord Ashdown has already said, and that is, Bosnia is getting proportionally and in numbers is getting the lowest possible aid from the EU, and it is because it is incapable and it cannot meet the conditionality so it can meet these. But why this happens, each time I think there is a long-term policy in Banja Luka to ensure that Bosnia is seen as a dysfunctional state.
Yep.
So every time that these conditions need to be fulfilled, you have a last-minute withdrawal from the Banja Luka support for it. And it has worked. as you can see, since 2014 and even before that, since 2006 actually, Bosnia is lagging behind because there's a long-term strategy to ensure that Bosnia is perceived and acts as a country that cannot be sustained. And while it marinates in this dysfunctional state, that the attention and support from the international community also subsides. And I think that the project so far is working, as you can see in these numbers.
That is, Mr. Chairman, that is so true. That is exactly what the Prime Minister of the Republic of Serbia is doing. Whether he wants to split away from Bosnia, I don't know. My guess is that he's put himself in a state of grace to do it, so that if the moment arrives and he feels he can do it, he might, but I don't think it's his intention. I don't think he's a nationalist. I think he's an opportunist in the same way as Milosevic was, and he uses nationalism as his lever, but his policy is exactly the same policy as the policy of Mirko Đukanović, the Prime Minister of Montenegro. And in Montenegro, they simply made the federation with Serbia completely unworkable until we lost patience and said, "Okay, have your own independence." And this is what is happening as well. And then I'm afraid that he's also very cannily playing the ability to bring other European Union nations to the position which says they're never going to work together, let him get on with it, just let it happen. So he has diplomatic representation in Brussels, and I'm afraid to say Brussels officials see the diplomatic representative of Republika Srpska in Brussels. Excuse me, this is not a state. It's a man who pretends that he's got a state within a state. Why on earth are we giving him any credibility? And when the High Representative, Cathy Ashton, goes to Bosnia and Herzegovina, she pays a special, it doesn't say to the Prime Minister, come and see me in Sarajevo. She goes to Banja Luka and sits down with him. By the way, on the table is a European flag and the flag of Republika Srpska, the television cameras. Not a flag of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's seen on every television camera around Bosnia. She has hugely reinforced the capacity of this man to play the fact that he is representative of a state, not a part of a state. Why do we give any diplomatic representation? Or why do we pay any notice to these people? And they have diplomatic representation in Hungary, which is quite wobbly on these things, and in some of those Eastern littoral countries, the Slav countries, particularly Poland, who are saying, well, why not? Just let him get on with it. It's going to be easier in the long run. The moment in the Balkans that you say, take the easy way out, you are on the way to a failure of foreign policy. And I'm afraid in the Balkans, that nearly always means it leads to something much worse than just diplomatic breakup.